Hello, and welcome to the Book Club Review. I'm Laura.
I'm Kate.
And this is the podcast about book clubs and the books that get you talking.
It's our second annual Booker Prize special, where we'll be discussing and debating each of this year's shortlisted books. We'll also be live streaming the awards ceremony itself in the background, so be prepared for our candid reactions to this year's winner. To help the discussion along, we're joined by journalist and previous podcast guest Phil Chafee, and welcoming a new friend to the show, Chrissy Ryan, owner of North London's Book Bar, which is the dream combination of bookshop and bar.
And so, the shortlist. Which books made the cut this year? Well, that includes Great Circle by Maggie Shipstead, The Fortune Men by Nadifa Mohammed, The Promise by Damon Galgut, No One Is Talking About This by Patricia Lockwood, A Passage North by Anouk Arud-Pergassim, and Bewilderment by Richard Powers.
Someone once said that judging the Booker Prize is like being in a particularly high-powered book club. A book club where every member will have read each shortlisted book 3 times by the time they come to discuss it. This year, the prize is being judged by writer and editor Horatia Harrod, actress Natasha McElhone, the 104th Archbishop of Canterbury, Dr. Rowan Williams, and twice Booker shortlisted author and professor Chigozie Obioma. They are chaired by Harvard professor Maya Jasanoff.
With the media blitz that generally surrounds the Booker Prize, you may well have already heard from the critics. You may have heard from the publishers. You may even have heard from the authors. So what exactly do we bring to the party? Well, we come to you as readers and as book clubbers. We know our views are our own and others will disagree, but for us, that's half the fun. We love the friction of a good-humoured, boisterous debate, frank but friendly. That tends to be our style.
So keep listening as we dig in to discuss what these books mean to us. What was our experience of reading them? Did we understand them? Would we recommend them? And which one do we think should win?
And so without further ado, let's get on with it. Our 2021 Booker Prize show.
Chrissy and Phil, thanks so much for joining us. It's great to have you both back on the show.
Thank you for having us.
It's great to be here.
We're here in the shed. We've got some drinks. We've got some snacks. In about 15 minutes, we're going to start watching the Booker ceremony live. I've made an absolutely massive assumption that they're going to announce the prize at the end of the 45-minute programme. If they don't do that, then we're in big trouble, or at least there won't be any suspense. But this is as close as we've ever come here at the Book Club Review podcast to a live broadcast, so we're going to just see what happens. I think we're going to see Douglas Stewart having tea with the Duchess of Cornwall.
That sounds glorious.
And we've got Laura joining us from Canada. Laura, do people care about the Booker Prize in Canada, do you think? Are they interested? Is there a buzz out there?
No, I think there's no buzz. I'm sure there are some isolated, enthusiastic readers, but I haven't seen any coverage. So I'm very delighted to be dialing into you guys so that I can be in on the action.
Now, I've watched quite a few things around this year's Booker Prize, and unsurprisingly, one question the judges often get asked is, what are they looking for? Chair of the judges, Maya Jasanoff, has said that this year's shortlist is linked by a few key qualities. It's immersive, with stories you can get absorbed in, voices that get inside your head, which she says is reflective of the experience of reading in lockdown. It's global in authors, in settings, and she says that this feels transporting in a year when so many of us have been confined to home. And it engages in matters of life and death, issues which to the judges felt poignantly pertinent.
So we'll get into it momentarily, but before we do, I should say, listeners, that we're going to discuss, but hopefully not spoil these books for you, just in case you haven't read them yet. Starting in no particular order, the very first book on our list is Great Circle by American novelist Maggie Shipstead.
It's a book that takes us from Prohibition-era Montana to wartime Britain to present-day Hollywood. Marion Graves, a mid-century aviatrix, has a burning ambition to fly a complete circle of the globe from the North to the South Pole. Half a century later, Hadley Baxter, a scandal-ridden Hollywood actress whose own parents perished in a plane crash, is irresistibly drawn to play Marion Graves. This role will lead her to uncover the real mystery behind the vanished pilot. The audiobook is narrated by Cassandra Campbell and Alex McKenna and published by Penguin. Here's a clip.
Little America 3, Ross Ice Shelf, Antarctica, March 4th, 1950. Final entry from The Sea, the Sky, the Birds Between, the Lost Logbook of Marion Graves. Published by D. Wenceslas and Sons, New York, 1959. I was born to be a wanderer. I was shaped to the earth like a seabird to a wave. Some birds fly until they die. I have made a promise to myself. My last descent won't be the tumbling, helpless kind, but a sharp gannet plunge. A dive with intent, aimed at something deep in the sea. I'm about to depart. I will try to pull the circle up from below, bringing the end to meet the beginning. I wish the line were a smooth meridian, a perfect taut hoop.
So I read this in the summer. This is like a trip down memory lane for me. But, coming back to it feels like just remembering an old friend. I mean, I would argue that in the character of Marion Graves, Shipstead's created just this unforgettable character. With the present-day actress, Hadley Baxter, arguably less so. Phil, how did this interplay between these two main characters work for you?
I definitely found the whole present-day story a slog to get through. I love this book. It was very cinematic, but it was a book. It was sort of a page-turner that I would put down and not want to pick up again. Therefore, it took me 3 months to read. I think a lot of what was slowing it down was this present-day story, which I would get there, and I just could not care less about the ups and downs of the Hollywood story. But I liked the book as a whole.
What's interesting about that, Phil, is that Hadley's story is roughly only 10% of the entire novel, I'd say. So that 10% was really slowing you down.
Yep.
Chrissy?
I really loved this novel, actually. But I agree with you, Phil, in that I did take a while to get into it because of the Hadley plotline. But once I was in, it was brilliant and I couldn't put it down and I loved the characters. I think for me, of the books on this list, I think Great Circle is the one that is the most grand in scope and immersive to read and probably the most up my street, to the extent that I wasn't sure if it would get shortlisted because it almost felt a bit too juicy.
Same. I was so surprised. I was like, this book is way too enjoyable and readable on a Booker shortlist. Like, what are they thinking? And I'm like, well, maybe they were trying to, mix in, get a really enjoyable, readable book into the mix. I mean, it's really unfair to Maggie Shipstead to suggest that she's the token readable choice on this list, but it's so, as you say, cinematic. It's so immersive. One thing I feel people maybe worry about who haven't read it yet is it is quite long.
Yes.
Quite a few people have said to me, it's just so long. And I'm like, but it's so good once you're in, if it grabs you and draws you in, which obviously, Phil, it sounds like it didn't for you. But for me, I was so happy that it was as long as it was because I was sort of savouring every page. I didn't want it to end.
Yeah, it's the characters that really make it, even though there might be a slight imbalance between how much you invest in the two main characters. But Marion's an amazing character. I want it to become a film because I want to see her on screen, played by Keira Knightley or someone.
It's also an amazing portrait of the era. Beyond these characters, there's these little tangents she goes on while she'll give a pot of history of actual historic figures, most of whom I knew nothing about. A lot of female aviators and others. It was a delight. It was a really good book.
Yeah, because she was inspired by real-life aviatrix Jean Batten, who was the first person to fly from England to New Zealand in 1934, and also, of course, Amelia Earhart, which is the one we all were familiar with. For me, I thought this interest in these female aviation pioneers and the underlying interest in women in history was what gave it depth and made it something more than just a thumping good read, a really great novel. And that's why I think it's on this shortlist.
It's got lots more depth to it than just a great story about a female aviator. And also, it's a book about storytelling. The reason why, to me, Hadley features as a character is because it lends that scope.
This is the contemporary actress. Who's
exactly.
Kind of like a sort of... who's that person I'm trying to think of in the Hunger Games movies?
Jennifer Lawrence.
I think we had the same discussion last time when I couldn't remember Jennifer Lawrence's name. And Laura and I talked about this on the pod, but a Jennifer Lawrence figure.
And actually, we had a listener write in following that discussion because we were speculating, or maybe I was speculating, that the inclusion of the Hadley story, because it wasn't executed, I thought, to the same standard, was it really necessary? Why did it have to be there? And a listener wrote in and she said for her, it was about the erasure of queer love stories from history because Marion's life was actually very different to the story that Hadley is performing in terms of what Hollywood has decided was her story. The reality was very different. Now, I don't think that was executed well enough. And I'm glad this is on the Booker Prize, but for me, that's why it's not. It's not a winner. If that subplot, that Hadley story had woven together in a bit more, I don't know, in a bit more nuanced way, if Hadley herself hadn't felt like just, I don't know, like a shell of a character, maybe winner, maybe classic of our time. And I should say, Chrissy, I say that when I love this book. It was a book I sought out. I sought it out long before the Booker Prize. I was like, that is the book for me. And it was.
Yeah.
I just don't think it's Booker Prize winner.
I think that's really interesting because it's certainly the one that before it was longlisted, I, as a bookseller in the shop, was putting into people's hands. Interestingly, and I slightly cockily back myself to be able to sell a book I've loved, you know, like that's my job. And interestingly, it was the one that I probably had a lower success rate in terms of getting people to read it before it got longlisted. And I wonder if it's the size, because it was a book I really enjoyed.
Yeah. What is it about long reads? Everyone's busy. People are used to reading things on Twitter. It's the decline of the long novel, isn't it?
I hope not.
Yeah, I hope not too.
I feel like that would be the perfect segue to one of the upcoming titles. But actually, first, we have a very different book, which is The Fortune Men by Nadifa Mohammed. Mahmoud Matan is a Somali seafarer who ends up living in 1950s Cardiff. He's a father, a chancer, a petty thief, many things in fact, but he is not a murderer. So when a shopkeeper is brutally killed and all eyes fall on him, Mahmoud isn't too worried, secure in his innocence in a country where justice is served. But as the trial nears, it starts to dawn on him that he is in a fight for his life, against conspiracy, prejudice, and the ultimate punishment. In the shadow of the hangman's noose, he realizes that the truth may not be enough to save him. We've got a clip from the audiobook, narrated by Hugh Quarshie, kindly provided by our friends at Penguin. Let's have a listen.
Tiger Bay, February 1952. The king is dead. Long live the queen. The announcer's voice crackles from the wireless and winds around the rapt patrons of Berlin's Milk Bar as sinuously as the fog curls around the mournful street lamps, their one glow barely illuminating the cobblestones. The noise settles as milkshakes and colas clink against Irish coffees and chairs scrape against the black and white tiled floor. Berlin hammers a spoon against the bar and calls out with his lion tamer's bark. Raise your glasses, ladies and gentlemen, and send off our old king to Davy Jones's locker. He'll meet many of our men down there, replies old Ismail. He better write his apologies on the way down. I bet he wrote them on his deathbed, a punter cackles. Through the rock and roll and spitting espresso machine, Berlin hears someone calling his name. Marshatiri? He asks as Mahmoud Matan pushes through the crowd at the bar. I said get me another coffee. Berlin catches his Trinidadian wife's waist and steers her towards Mahmoud. Lou, sort this troublemaker another coffee. Ranged along the bar are many of Tiger Bay's Somali sailors. They look somewhere between gangsters and dandies in their cravats, pocket chains, and trilby hats. Only Mahmoud wears a Homburg pulled down low over his gaunt face and sad eyes. He is a quiet man, always appearing and disappearing silently at the fringes of the sailors or the gamblers or the thieves. Men pull their possessions closer when he is around and keep their eyes on his long, elegant fingers.
It's vivid, it's colourful. For me, this was a very unexpected portrait of Cardiff. Who knew it was such a multicultural melting pot back in the 1950s? I didn't. Chrissy, were you surprised by this book as I was?
Yeah, I was really surprised by what a great story it was and what a sad story it was. I really enjoyed it.
I thought it was great. The frame of reference I have in my head is the Steve McQueen Small Axe, which is this reclaiming modern British history. But she does it in such a colorful way, and particularly I think the central character. He could have been a saint, but she makes him in this amazing, multidimensional... He feels like a fully realized individual with his backstory in Somalia and traveling all over the world. He's sort of a petty thief. He can be a bit misogynist to his wife. So he's not by any means a saint, but he's just such a fully fleshed out character. And I was sobbing by the end.
Were you?
Yeah.
I have to say, my experience of reading this book, Well, I can't quite decide, but I wondered at the time if it had been ruined by the fact that I knew from something I'd read online about the story and how it ended. Because this is based on a real life story. And I guess people writing about the book probably have found it impossible not to talk about the real life story. But the trouble is, if you know what the ending is going to be because you have read something about the book and you know the real life story, there's absolutely no sense of any kind of anticipation. For me, it was just this inexorable, depressing spiral. The racism, the things that these different characters endured, the injustice, and the way it was written didn't really help me with that. It's like the author knows it's a depressing story and she wanted to hold it up. But then when I finished it, I felt so overwhelmed and humbled by her bringing this story to light, her bringing this forgotten story back into public consciousness. And I love that this is on the shortlist. I want people to read this book, and I'm sorry I maybe haven't sold it to you. But as I say, I just felt so humbled by her work. And I read that apparently she's been working on this for 20 years. You know, this is a story that is so important to her. And I thought she really did do it justice. So I had very conflicting opinions about this book as I read it. I did think it would be brilliant for book club for that reason.
Yeah.
Great discussion book.
The author's note at the end really helps you to understand the book in the sense of the way that she talks about the research that she did, the relationships she had with the family, of people that knew the family. That to me was a really lovely, or at least enlightening addition to the end of the book. But interestingly, Kate, I was sold the book by the publishers in the sense of when they were sending out advance copies and things, I was sold it with the ending told to me.
Well, exactly. It's been
part of the marketing.
Part of the marketing. And when I was looking at reviews online, some people were grumbling about that, like, same as me. If you've read what happens at the end, talk about plot spoilers. And I just don't know, so much of my frustration with this book was because I just found it so bleak. And maybe if I hadn't known the ending.
So I've been quietly hanging back.
That's the ceremony starting up, the live stream of the ceremony. They've just appeared in the background. They're in the Radio 4 studio. So let's just turn them down and we will have them quietly ticking away in the background so we can hear what they're up to.
See.
Carry on, Laura. You were saying.
I've been quietly hanging back because this is the one novel I didn't manage to read. I didn't forget, Kate. I didn't make a mistake like last year's episode, which was all very embarrassing. I just couldn't get to it. And I have to say it dropped to the bottom of the list because I suspected it would be quite grueling. On the point, though, of knowing the end, I don't know how you couldn't know the end because she's chosen to tell this story because it is historically significant.
Yeah.
I won't say any more than that, but, you know, that significance leads you to some conclusions.
I, in some ways, Kate, disagree with you in that sometimes I think it's important to know the ending, particularly when it's a true story. It's actually less about the ending and more about the inevitability that, of course, it's always going to end up in that situation because, unfortunately, in the 1950s in Cardiff, that was the inevitability of what was going to happen to a man like him in a situation like that. And I think that maybe that adds more gravitas because it's not a whodunit or a how's this going to go. It's just about the inevitable and how the inevitable happens.
I
which
really
is sad.
agree. Because you know the ending, reading the book, it's just sort of like this careful anatomy of watching each structure of the structural racism lock into place. And that was just so fascinating and so engaging.
And it's written in quite an interesting way, isn't it? In that she plays around with the form. At one point, she's including transcripts of the trial.
Yeah.
And so it's as if you're there and you're just...
Which was amazing.
Yeah, so I felt like there were lots of different ways that were quite clever that she kept it interesting. Yeah, I was very moved by it at the end. It is a really interesting book.
What I'm not hearing from you guys, though, is any clear take on whether this is a winner?
I think it's a dark horse.
I do too.
I agree. It would not shock me if this won. It's not what I will predict, and it's not what I would vote for.
Yeah, I think I feel the same. So I guess if I wouldn't vote for it, then On Instagram, there's a lady called Sherry who's been reading all of the books and she has a hashtag going. And so she's got people reviewing and responding and they're all collecting up their reviews. Anyway, she did a lovely summation the other day. And she said, it's been a really interesting year because every single book has something about it that really moved her or made her feel differently or taught her something. They all deserved a place for one reason or another. And I think it's tough to call.
I think this year's list is really strong.
The trusty online reviews. Mr. R.S. Eliot gives it 5 stars. Said a brilliant read, had me in tears at the end. I feel like I've lived among the various characters of all shapes and sizes in Tiger Bay, have come to know Mahmoud and his story of injustice. I laughed, winced, worried and sobbed while reading this book, a page-turner for sure. But Donny Rock gave it 3 stars and said disappointing. The story is good but marred, I feel, by too much detail and reminiscences. The picture of the Cardiff of that era is frightening. The verbatim description of the court hearings is off-putting. I found it a ponderous read. So there you go.
Ooh.
All right, what's next?
We are now going to turn to The Promise by Damon Galgut. On their farm outside Pretoria, the Swart family are gathering for Ma's funeral. The youngest child, Amer, detests everything the family stands for, not least their failed promise to the black woman who has worked for them her whole life. After years of service, Salome was promised her own house, her own land. Yet somehow, as decades pass, that promise remains unfulfilled. The book is narrated in turn by different members of the family, with each section marked by a death. The judges were apparently struck by the unusual way the author handles the narrative perspective, and admired the way Galgut was able to make a strong commentary, not only on the history of South Africa, but on humanity itself. It's a novel that asks, does true justice exist in this world? And what might that look like? The audiobook is narrated by Peter Noble and published by Penguin. Here's a clip.
The moment the metal box speaks her name, Amor knows it's happened. She's been in a tense, headachy mood all day, almost like she had a warning in a dream but can't remember what it is. Some sign or image just under the surface. Trouble down below, fire underground. But when the words are said to her aloud, she doesn't believe them. She closes her eyes and shakes her head. No, it can't be true, what her aunt has just told her. Nobody is dead. It's a word, that's all. She looks at the word, lying there on the desk like an insect on its back with no explanation. This is in Miss Starkey's office, where the voice over the tannoy told her to go. Amor has been waiting and waiting for this moment for so long, has imagined it so many times, that it already seems like a fact. But now that the moment has really come, it feels far away and dreamy. It hasn't happened, not actually, and especially not to Ma, who will always be alive. I'm sorry, Miss Starkey says again, covering her big teeth behind thin, pressed-together lips. Some of the other girls say Miss Starkey is a lesbian, but it's hard to imagine her doing anything sexy with anyone. Or maybe she did once, and has been permanently disgusted ever since. It's a sorrow we all have to bear, she adds in a serious voice, while Tani Marina trembles and dabs at her eyes with a tissue. Though she has always looked down on Ma, and doesn't care at all that she's dead, even if she isn't.
I think that narrative voice the judges found interesting is the way that it jumps from viewpoint to viewpoint. Sometimes it's the author, sometimes you, the reader, are the narrator, which is quite clever, but disconcerting. But for me, it never jarred. I actually found it a really seamless reading experience. I wasn't bothered by that at all. Occasionally, I did wish it would kind of settle down a bit, but overall, I was really happy to go with the flow. Phil, how did you find that narrative voice?
I love the narrative voice. I thought it was incredibly accomplished. One thing I really loved, which sounds like it would take away from it, but he would occasionally say, and then the person put on a shirt, and that maybe they didn't put on a shirt, maybe they did this other thing, but just sort of this almost like 19th century meta approach to being the author, which just worked, and it worked with the material, and I thought this book was absolutely brilliant.
Yeah, I could not agree more. I thought that it's the most ingenious narrative structure and voice, and I was completely blown away by it. It just sung, and the way that it shifted perspective from different characters. It was not a book I was excited about being on the long list, but it was a book that completely captured me, and I thought, oh, wow.
Chrissy, I had the same experience because I read a Guardian article and it was talking about the themes of this shortlist and the theme of death. Every moment that we interact with this family, it's because of a death. And I always thought, oh, fun. But then I downloaded a couple Kindle samples to dip my toe in and see which one would grip me. And The Promise had me right away because the tone is It is a funny book. There's a lot in this book that makes you cringe and laugh and feels very human.
I thought, like The Fortune Men, I love the way that the characters, sometimes they behave really well, sometimes they behaved badly. The main character, Anton, I really liked him, but he was incredibly flawed. And I kind of love that because people are like that. They can be really mixed and it doesn't stop you liking them sometimes.
Absolutely. And I loved the way that it moved through time as well. It not only moved through these incredible perspectives and different people and sometimes objects, but it also, which sounds really pretentious, but it isn't pretentious at all when you're reading it. You know, it's a sort of book that could be really pretentious and just doesn't feel it to read it. But it also moves really well through time. So you get this really epic sweep over time of how apartheid happened and what happened and the way it, even within families, at the beginning, the whole family is alive. I was expecting it to be spanning 100 years or something and lots of generations, but it's really only 2 generations of a family, and so cleverly done that you still see 50 years of history. And I learnt a lot too, which I think for me is a really big thing in a novel. It doesn't have to happen, but I love a novel through which I learn something. And that's something also that most of these books have in common. They really teach you something about the world.
For me, this is the one where when I finished it, I drew in a breath. And what I loved was the scope of it. Not only is he telling this vivid, readable story with these great characters that you really engage with, but he's also tackling, I suppose, white guilt in South Africa and how that might feel for the generation who are growing up post-apartheid. Amor, the young girl who opens the novel, her understanding of the situation and her relationships with the people around her and the responsibility she feels, not through anything she did, but that has all been handed down and she's inherited that. And I found that fascinating and remarkable, and I really admired him for trying to get a take on that, you know, a read on that we could understand and that would mean something. And not only then South Africa, but I think, as the judges say, it's about humanity more generally. You know, what is justice and what does that look like?
Yeah.
So that's why for me, this was the one I thought, wow, yeah.
Yeah, I would agree. I thought it's a really strong list, but this book had a bit of everything and all very, very, very well done.
Laura, did I skip you? I can see you there on the screen.
No, you didn't skip me. And I do agree with you that it's a super strong contender. I don't want to open up a can of worms. We got to get to the next book. But is Amor a bit too much of a saint? Just a little bit, maybe. Just a little bit. That ending, I don't know.
Great question.
Well, I love that she tries to do the right thing, but even that act, you find yourself questioning. You think, well, is that enough? I'm not sure that it is.
Also, you have the spectrum of different responses, don't you? You have the kind of indifferent, you have the people that want to protect their own interests, and then you have the Amor figure who wants to help but actually ends up not helping, or, you know, she is flawed in her attempts to help. I don't know, what do you think, Phil?
Yeah, I agree with Laura. At the same time, this is such a racist family, deeply unsympathetic racist family, that it would just be such a dark novel if Amor was a bit more realistic and a bit less saintly.
Yeah, that's a fair take.
And I'm with you, Chrissy, when you say there's a spectrum. You know, I feel like I could be very easily persuaded around to your point of view.
Meanwhile, at the Booker ceremony behind us, we've just seen Douglas Stewart having tea with the Duchess of Cornwall. Apparently that was something that he was supposed to do after he won last year, but couldn't because of COVID.
Aww.
So they finally got to sit down together. I'm fascinated by the way the Duchess of Cornwall has kind of come forth as a reader. Have you been following her reading room on Instagram?
No.
Completely.
It's her book club.
Yeah, it's so interesting. The Duchess of Cornwall has this book club, and they're not choosing always contemporary books that are happening right now, which is not what normally happens. Not that I think you always should, but I think it's interesting that they're really not.
She did Where the Crawdads Sing.
Yeah.
Phil's just looking like he has no response to that. Yeah. Anyway, yes, he's quite right. We should not get lost on a tangent about the Duchess of Cornwall. So what's next?
Next up is No One Is Talking About This by Patricia Lockwood. We have discussed this on the pod because it was nominated for the Women's Prize. Our narrator is a social influencer, an online talking head not dissimilar to Lockwood herself. Judge Rowan Williams says the resulting narrative style embraces the mayfly attention span of social media to tell a story of two halves. First, the narrator is preoccupied with her experiences writing, you could say even living, on and through social media. But then halfway through, there is a shift when a family tragedy means real suffering, real love, and real loss appear on the scene.
Of the book, Williams says, it tells a deeply moving story with deep emotional truthfulness, and that left us wondering about the processes by which any kind of human language is always expanding to cope with the expansiveness of changing human relations and changing human perceptions. And we've got a clip from the audiobook read by Kristen C. It's published by Bloomsbury. Let's have a listen.
She opened the portal, and the mind met her more than halfway. Inside, it was tropical and snowing, and the first flake of the blizzard of everything landed on her tongue and melted. Close-ups of nail art, a pebble from outer space, a tarantula's compound eyes, a storm like canned peaches on the surface of Jupiter, Van Gogh's The Potato Eaters, a chihuahua perched on a man's erection, a garage door spray-painted with the words, "Stop, don't email my wife." Why did the portal feel so private when you only entered it when you needed to be everywhere? She felt along the solid green marble of the day for the hairline crack that might let her out. This could not be forced. Outside, the air hung swagged, and the clouds sat in piles of couch stuffing. And in the south of the sky, there was a tender spot where a rainbow wanted to happen. Then 3 sips of coffee, and a window opened.
This is another book that feels like an old friend. I wanted to reread it, but of course I didn't have the time. Chrissy's got my copy there in front of her, which looks like a hedgehog because it's got so many post-it notes. I feel like you're a bit of a woman of the internet age. How did this one land with you?
It's so interesting because I should be Patricia Lockwood's super fan. This book should have been my book on the shortlist, and it's a little bit cold for me. I, as you can probably tell, love warmth. That doesn't have to be, you know, shiny and happy and song and dance, but it just lacked the warmth that I really enjoy and grips me. That's not to say it's not a brilliant book. I just think it's not my book.
Chrissy, I totally disagree with you. I am not a woman of the internet, not really. I'm not on Twitter. It's not my bag. And yet I found this book and its portrait of the relationships between the family in the second half, her and her father finally coming together. You know, they're on 2 divides of the spectrum. I found it so moving and so poignant. It's so funny how 2 different readers bring something completely different to the same text.
Completely. I wish that I had reread it because I do wonder if I was in a different space to when I'd read it months ago. Maybe I felt too seen. Maybe I felt the coldness because I was prickled by it.
Yeah, because if you were online and you were participating in those things as they were happening or witnessing them, it is a little bit almost accusatory, isn't it, somehow? But because I'm so detached from all of that, I was just a bit like, oh, you know, well, that's Twitter. You know? Phil, how about you?
I thought this was delightful. I'd really enjoyed her previous memoir, Priest Daddy. I'm with Laura on the warmth. I think this family, even though they're all over the place politically, there is just this innate warmth that comes through that I really like. With all that said, it's not a book that stays with me. I laughed a lot. I enjoy it. I'll read her next book, particularly if I can return to this family again, but it has not kept me thinking about it since I read it.
At the time, when we did our Women's Prize podcast, I grumbled and argued that it shouldn't really be on there because it wasn't a novel. It was a memoir. I've since massively come around on the whole autofiction memoir novel. It's okay. I think Elizabeth, who was with us on that pod, was strongly of the opinion that it didn't matter. It could be what it wants. I am now of that opinion too. I have come around. But I have still the nagging feeling when I think about this book that for me, I just didn't think she did enough with it to satisfy me. It felt like she just wrote down things that she had seen and experienced, and it wasn't that I didn't like it. It wasn't that I didn't like that she'd done that. I did, but I was slightly surprised that it had found itself on the Booker shortlist. It's been kind of accorded the weight that it has.
I agree with you, Kate. I think it's on there as a very of-the-moment book. I would say the same of Bewilderment, which is our last title to discuss. But in contrast, A Passage North by Anouk Arud-Pragasam, which is the next book up for discussion, I feel like this is a book that has earned its place on this list by sheer greatness. I won't go on just yet. You go first, Kate. Tell our listeners about it.
Yes, as Ben Oakrey is on the screen behind us being interviewed as part of the Booker Live ceremony, and yes, we come to A Passage North. A Passage North is a slow, meandering journey into the thoughts and impressions of Krishan, a 20-something Sri Lankan Tamil living in Colombo. Over the course of 72 hours, Krishan travels north to attend the funeral of Rani, the former carer to his aged grandmother and one of many traumatized survivors of Sri Lanka's 30-year civil war. Judge Horatio Harrod describes the author as having a profound, meticulous attentiveness to everyday experience. The result is a style unlike anything else, with long, looping paragraphs and no dialogue that nonetheless build up their own hypnotic momentum. The judges felt Arud Pragasam was taking on the question of how we can grasp the present, make sense of it, while also reckoning with the past, with history. The audiobook of A Passage North is narrated by Neil Shah and published by W.F. Howes. In the US, it's published by Penguin Random House. Here's a clip.
His body heavy from having woken up so early, Krishan was sitting on his haunches, leaning back against one of the tall iron posts that rose from the platform, watching the people around him with the dense, trance-like clarity that often takes hold when one is up before the day, when everything outside is still shrouded in the pitch-black darkness that directly precedes dawn. The train, which was scheduled for 5:15, had not yet arrived, and the platform had filled up with people, with middle-aged men, older couples, and families sitting or standing in the cool darkness of the morning, gazing out in silence at the trains arriving and departing on the other tracks. He was watching a family of 5 who had stopped not far from where he was sitting, standing in a circle near the edge of the platform around 3 large pieces of luggage. The mother and father were looking around the station with quiet but focused curiosity, as if they might be called upon to draw the scene from memory later on. The 3 teenage children, 2 girls and a boy, leaning on the bags with seeming indifference, lost in the dim blue glow of their phones. The parents looked like they might still live in the country, but it was obvious from the appearance of the children that the family was visiting from abroad. Their foreignness, like that of many diasporic children, immediately recognizable by the clothes they wore, their tight, branded shirts and tank tops, their loose tracksuits and form-fitting jeans. On another day, Krishan might have tried to speculate about the family's origins and the circumstances under which they'd left, studying how the parents were dressed, whether the children spoke Tamil or the language of their adopted home, how nervous or at ease they seemed to be returning to their place of origin. Today, though, he simply gazed at them without curiosity, not in the mood to analyze or conjecture, content to give sensation precedence over thought, as he sat there waiting for the train.
I have a confession to make. I didn't finish it.
You didn't finish it? How far did you get?
I calibrated my Booker reading very finely down to the wire, but I did not allow for the fact that yesterday my entire day was taken up by having to choose tiles and lino for the house that we're renovating currently, and that apparently that decision could not wait. So,
crucially,
yeah, to
how
my
far
great
did you
shame.
get in? How many pages
I'm about
did you
a
get
third
in?
of the way through. So I
Interesting.
read enough to think, oh man, I can't believe I'm not going to finish this. I feel like this is really good. It's very dense, isn't it? There are a lot of words, but when you allow yourself to just relax into that and let it flow over you, I thought it was beautifully written, and I thought it was really interesting, these characters that he was introducing me to. I was already heartbroken by the description of the grandmother and her gradual decline as she aged. I just thought that was so moving and true. And I mean, if it goes on in that vein, even though I haven't finished it, now I'm wondering, is this the winner?
Phil?
I would love it to be the winner. This was by far my favorite book.
Yay!
Sounds like Laura as well.
Phil, yay!
I thought it was absolutely brilliant. It stuck with me. Passages still sticks with me. I want to read. I got obsessed with Arud Pragasam, the author, and he has this amazing interview from July with the Paris Review, where they asked him, what are some of the aspects of novel writing that you don't pay as much attention to? And he said, story, creating a well-rounded character, setting, dialogue, historical context. I try to pay attention to these things. I do try, but they're always afterthoughts. And therefore, the question is, what is he paying attention to? And he just has these amazing philosophical thoughts, which sounds very dry. I do think he succeeds in just giving this amazing setting. The character, the grandmother, really sticks with me, but also just these amazing passages on the nature of freedom and on locking eyes with strangers in the subway and what that entails. And I was blown away by this book.
Laura.
Me too. And listeners, you're thinking, gosh, this sounds so dry and boring. And I tell you, I was 50 pages in and we were still in Krishan's mind as he went for a long walk along the beach in Colombo. It was the same walk. You know, this walk was probably 2 hours and we were 50 pages in, and I don't think the walk ends until about page 77. But by page 77, I was so hooked and I loved this book. I think it's exceptional. I really hope it wins. I've seen a few people bubbling up on Instagram saying the same. So I'm really keeping my fingers crossed. And now I'm wondering what Chrissy thinks.
I love this conversation because I also have to admit that I haven't yet finished it. Oh, no. But what I have read, I'm quite staggered by in terms of the writing. I couldn't agree more with everything that you've all said. I do think it's really dense, which is why I didn't allocate enough time, because I thought I'd be able to whiz through it, but actually found myself just getting caught up. And that, to me, is a really good book, isn't it? Where I can speed read, and it's what I do a lot of the time because I would need to get through as much as I possibly can. But in this instance, it didn't do it justice. So I slowed down.
That's why I didn't finish it, because I just thought, I can't race through this.
Yeah. When a book like this comes along, I have to really commit to it because you want to give it the justice it deserves and the time it deserves.
Can we also take a moment to reflect on the fact that the author is either 33 or 34? Like, how is that possible? The wisdom and insight he brings to his reflections are just insane. I cannot wait to see what else he writes.
Yeah. What is also great is reading a book set in Sri Lanka about that period of history in Sri Lanka, because I knew so little about it. And I will always go on about how I love learning stuff through fiction. And I will always bang the drum for reading fiction in order to understand the world and learn something, because now I want to read way more about this place in this period of history.
He also weaves in old Tamil myths and Buddhist stories and just all this other stuff in a seamless way, and then toggles between the central story of going on a train to a funeral in northern Sri Lanka, and then basically another train ride with his former girlfriend in India. And there's basically no plot in this story, but it's astonishing.
And I love that blending of the personal preoccupations that are with us every day that are really quite self-centered, but blending that with the scope and looking at atrocity and what that means for people. And at the same time, in the face of atrocity, we're only human and we can only kind of come back to what matters to us. And in this case, that's him thinking about his ex-girlfriend who's just got in touch via email.
I can see on the screen behind me, what they're doing is that they're doing dramatizations of each of the 6 books. So that means that they're gearing up for the announcement. We've got time to talk about Bewilderment by Richard Powers, which tells the story of a widowed astrobiologist, Theo, single parent to his 9-year-old son, Robin, who is not neurotypical and so under threat of being medicated and treated differently by his peers. His father has the opportunity to allow his son to take part in an experimental psychological treatment where he is exposed to the emotions of his mother, recorded before she died. It's part science fiction, part real world, set in the near future. Maya Janosov said, "It's a clarion call for us to wake up and realise what our minds might truly be capable of if we were less obedient to the status quo." The audiobook is read by Eduardo Ballerini and is published by Penguin. Here's a clip.
Oddly enough, there's no name in the DSM for the compulsion to diagnose people. When his school suspended Robin for 2 days and put their own doctors on the case, I felt like the last reactionary throwback. What was there to explain? Synthetic clothing gave him hideous eczema. His classmates harassed him for not understanding their vicious gossip. His mother was crushed to death when he was 7. His beloved dog died of confusion a few months later. What more reason for disturbed behavior did any doctor need? Watching medicine fail my child, I developed a crackpot theory. Life is something we need to stop correcting. My boy was a pocket universe I could never hope to fathom. Every one of us is an experiment, and we don't even know what the experiment is testing. My wife would have known how to talk to the doctors. Nobody's perfect, she liked to say. But man, we all fall short so beautifully.
I was a bit nervous about reading this, just because of my wariness about books about climate change, which just kill me. I'm just so anxious and worried and stressed, and it's the last thing I want to read about. But in some ways, this is a kind of a hopeful book. It leaves you with a new appreciation for the natural world that we have. And if anything, I feel like it moves you and inspires you to pay attention to that world and to value it. As he says at one point, we're so rich, we don't realize it, that everything that we have. And I did find hope in that. For me, what was problematic about this was the fact that it was set in the near future and the intermingling of science fiction, which meant that I was never quite sure how much to believe. And I found myself questioning, I think, things that he maybe didn't want me to question, like the relationship between this father and his son, and the son's voice and who the son was. It was slightly unsettling, and ultimately I felt like that meant that the message that I think perhaps he was trying to give got a bit lost. I liked it. I did like it. I enjoyed reading it, much more than I thought I would. Chrissy?
I will prelude what I'm about to say about Bewilderment with, frankly, how much I adored the Overstory.
The Tree Book.
Exactly.
Which I haven't read.
Oh, well, it's one of my favourite ever books.
People do rave about
it's
it.
Astonishing, and it's one of those books that I thought I'm never going to like a 600-page novel about trees. Like, come on, that is not my jam. And it's so my jam. It's amazing. Anyway, prelude my comments on Bewilderment with that, because what he does so well in both the Overstory, and I'm sure in his other books that I haven't read, and Bewilderment, is go into the intricacies of nature and humanity and find the connections between the universe or the soil or trees or whatever he's talking about, and link them to the way that humans work and find the connections. And I just think he does it so exquisitely. He's one of the most beautiful, elegant writers I've ever read. I loved the Overstory. I liked Bewilderment. I just found it so bleak. So bleak. I think he's an astonishing writer. I thought his turn of phrase, the things I learnt about space and climate and all that kind of thing.
The nudie branches.
The nudie branches.
So, for anyone who hasn't read Bewilderment, and I read Bewilderment unusually for me, but I had it on my Kindle, but I was reading it on my phone, which I never normally do. But what was really great and particularly useful, and I would recommend doing that with this book, is that you can click on things you don't understand, and it will immediately pop up a window that tells you about them. And nudie branch turns out to be a kind of sea slug.
Yeah.
That the son is obsessed with. If a son was asked what his favourite animal was, he would say it's a nudibranch. And I looked them up, and it's my favourite animal now. They're amazing.
They're very cool.
They're so cool.
I used to do diving and see lots of nudibranches. If you did a night dive,
Who
they're
knew
very
they were
cool.
down there?
Yeah,
So
very
I
cool.
learn things from this, which I love.
I could not stand this book.
Me neither, Phil. Phil, it's terrible.
Since I've hated a book this much. Like, I just thought it was front to start awful. I thought it was like treacly, saccharine. I wanted to punch the kid. I was just...
He was a bit... I found the kid, the son, a little bit too... He didn't feel real because he felt too eloquent.
Yeah.
He felt like an adult in a child's body, which may be very true.
Well, I think that was the science fiction, wasn't it? That he becomes an adult in a child's body because of his mother.
True.
But I have to say, I'm completely on the same page with Phil. I thought it was melodramatic guff.
Yes.
The mother's a total saint, the ultimate Madonna figure until she's not. And then so you have this like Madonna horror complex coming in. And the father, like there are decisions that the father makes, crucially at the very end, that are so out of character and yet have such huge consequences. I couldn't even get emotional about the ending. I was just like, oh, for heaven's sake, this would never happen. This father would never let this happen. And the researcher, the neuroscientist, who's just this like sleazy, flat, like I just found everyone incredibly unsympathetic and flat. And yet, I agree with you, Chrissy, that his depiction of nature and his ability to take us into these other worlds and to think about what life means, I enjoyed that. I'm just not sure that he really understands people. Is that unfair?
That's so interesting. I really agree with what you're saying in terms of that was what made this book much weaker than the Overstory for me. It's why I simply liked it, because I think his writing's incredible. But yes, I agree with you that I wasn't convinced by the story or the characters. which is a shame because he's a magnificent writer. That said, I would still recommend people read it, but I'd tell them to read the Overstory instead.
This is the book that feels out of place on the shortlist for me, but Chrissy, you make a good point. Maybe it's...
Laura,
maybe
I'm going to have to
the
stop you
judges-
because I think Maya Jasanoff is about to make the announcement.
It was tough.
Let's listen in.
Arrived at a decision after a lot of discussion and arrived at a consensus around a book that is a real master of form and pushes the form in new ways, that has an incredible originality and fluidity of voice, and a book that's really dense with historical and metaphorical significance.
I think it could be The Promise.
And that book
I'm holding up The Promise to everyone.
The Promise.
is The Promise.
Woo! Hey! Yay! Wow. Oh, that's great. Yeah. I mean, they're all worthy in their own ways, for absolute sure. This was the one that united us the most, I think.
Yeah, I'm certainly not upset that you won.
Also, I win a bet, so that's good.
So he's coming to the stage. Shall we listen to his? Shall we listen to his remarks?
It's taken a long while to get here, and now that I have, I kind of feel that I shouldn't be here. This could just as easily have gone to any of the other amazing, talented people on this list and a few others who aren't. But seeing as the good fortune's fallen to me, let me say this has been a great year for African writing, and I'd like to accept this on behalf of all the stories told and untold, the writers heard and unheard from the remarkable continent that I'm part of. Please keep listening to us. There's a lot more to come. I want to thank, I have a lot of wonderful publishers, but in particular tonight I'd love to thank Clara Farmer and her fabulous team at Chatto and Windus. Thanks to my agent, Caroline Wood at the Felicity Bryan Agency, to my ex-agent, Tony Peake, who looked after me for 40-odd years until recently retiring. It's safe to say I wouldn't be here tonight without all of you. And then last, but definitely not last, my thanks to the Booker judges and to everybody connected with this powerful prize. You know, it's changed my life, and please know that I am really profoundly, humbly grateful for this. Thank you.
He's a very nice man.
Yeah, he seems like a sweetie.
That was a really nice, acceptance speech, I thought.
He gave me goosebumps at one point. He was very gracious.
Well, let's leave them there as he's interviewed a bit more. So that was
I have
fun.
to say-
I'm almost sad I know now, though. You know, it's taken all the fun.
It's been such a good discussion. Yeah, it really has. Like, I've really enjoyed hearing all your hot takes.
I
and
have
thoughts.
to confess to being secretly relieved that A Passage North didn't win, just because I felt so bad about not having finished it. But I will finish it. Of course I'll finish
completely.
it.
I'd have been so embarrassed.
I hope you finish it. It is really good.
And I have to confess that I'm marginally disappointed that Bewilderment by Richard Powers didn't win, because I just wanted to go full tantrum. I saw it was a front runner and I was like, what? No, it couldn't possibly.
I think that The Promise deserved to win in terms of the form and the style and the intelligence of the writing and the originality of the writing. I think what the judges said in their announcement speech, to me, summed up why it was a very worthy winner.
Yeah, I completely agree. And it's very almost innovative, but just it feels just a very fresh voice, but also what it's dealing with and the issues of privilege and race and all of these things are obviously so incredibly important right now. Yeah, I thought it was an amazing book.
Now we've got a bit more time, I can read my internet reviews of The Promise. Adam gave it 5 stars, said, in The Promise, Damon Galgut achieves something unique. His mellifluous prose and fluid structure, the freedom to range across viewpoints and time, make this a work of art that could be expressed only in this form. It is a true novel. If it doesn't win this year's Booker Prize, and any other prize going for that matter, then I don't know what will. Then he says, the only complaint I have about this book is the cover. It's one of those matte finishes that feels horrible to touch and gets covered with fingerprints. 6 stars for the author and 4 for the publisher. I read it on Kindle, so I wouldn't know. Oh,
I love
great.
a matte finish. Though.
Yeah, I love a matte finish. They're so sexy. Yeah.
Meanwhile, over on Instagram, Manos Sakiris got in touch to say, brilliantly written. Although I was never really surprised by the story, it was told in such a powerful way that I did not mind. Loved how the narrating voice was temporarily handed over to the characters, and then it returned to the narrator. Loved the transitions in terms of space and time, loved how the characters truly came alive, a book which is easy to recommend and probably a worthy winner. But, it's not for everyone. Roman Claudia gave it 3 stars, but she noted it's hard to say something new when reviewing South African history in these sweeping terms, especially for me, when Nadine Gordimer has made the topic so much her own, with great subtlety and distinction. If this book had spent more time on the current issues in post-apartheid South Africa, it might have carved out more space for itself. The combination of fuzzy writing style and returning to a history done before didn't work well for me. So, I just think great for book club. It's going to be a really good one to discuss. I would have said that anyway, I think.
Have any of you read Maury Galgut?
No. He's a very established author, isn't he?
This is fifth novel or something.
Yeah, and he's been shortlisted before. I think this is the second time he's been shortlisted, or maybe longlisted, but he's certainly not a stranger to the Booker. And so I feel conflicted when there's something like this happens, and that it's a really brilliant book, but did you want someone like Nadifa Muhammad to win? It just in terms of the fact that she's written this really astonishing book that has so much about it that is worthy, and you sort of want a book like that to win. But then equally, you're thrilled for someone like Damon Galgut, who's really carved out a space through merit over many years and has written an extraordinary book that does deserve to win. There are sometimes years where you feel like the book that wins is a sort of nod to a book that didn't win a few years before. Yeah. And I don't feel like that with The Promise. I think it absolutely deserved it in its own right.
I'm really thrilled that he has won. And I feel like if Bewilderment had won, I think I would have brought that criticism that Richard Powers was being awarded perhaps for a better book in the past rather than for the book in front of us. Whereas I think The Promise is a great read. Exactly as you guys have said, it's so intelligent yet accessible. And Chrissy, not that we are wanting to educate everyone, but obviously there was a lot to learn for me in this story about apartheid and South African history. I think this year's shortlist was really, really great, minus Bewilderment.
I agree. It was one of my favourite shortlists for a while. It felt a bit more classic, but there was enough edge in there for me.
I love the sci-fi actually in Bewilderment and the way he takes the boy to these different planets. And it reminded me of Ted Chiang, who we did for the podcast, who is an amazing sci-fi short story writer.
Exhalations
is the book.
But he's not as good as
Chiang. If the whole book had been that, if the whole book had been that...
Agreed.
That's what the overstory is.
That awful plot.
That's what the overstory is. Just about trees.
Anyway, you know what? Watching various videos of the judges talking about the process, one thing that they kept coming back to that I thought was really nice to hear was that they were, all of them saying that for them, the thing that had made the experience enjoyable, because they have to read 158 books, they then arrive at their long list, they read all of those books again, then they read the shortlist books again. It's just an unbelievable amount of reading. It must be fairly grueling, but they all said that what they really loved about the process was the discussion, was the debates and the conversations, and that had led them to engage with the books differently, and maybe they had come around to someone else's point of view, and all of these books are brilliant for that. You could do any one of them for your book club and you would get a really rich discussion, and it would be fun to think about them and talk about them and reflect on them. So they're all winners.
And on that, thank you, Phil and Chrissy, for joining us on today's pod. It has been so much fun. And to Kate for organizing us and managing to get the live stream at just the right moment. That announcement came just in time. You nailed it.
It's really fun too.
So nervous.
Really fun.
About missing it.
It's been a joy. Thank you so much for having us. Here's to next year.
Yeah,
bring it on.
Absolutely.
Let's do it again next
Same
year.
again.
That's all for this episode.
If you enjoyed this show, check out our website, where you can find our archive of over 100 episodes to browse through. Everything from book club discussions to our reading roundups and interviews with literary folk. You can also explore our library of book reviews and articles. We just published one on our favourite podcasts. Have a look and find out the shows we listen to when we're not working on ours.
If you'd like to see what we're up to between episodes, follow us on Instagram or Facebook at Book Club Review Podcast, on Twitter at BookClubRVWPod, or you can always email us at thebookclubreview@gmail.com. And if you're not already, why not subscribe to us on iTunes or wherever you get your podcasts? If you like what we do, please take a moment to rate and review the show. It helps other listeners find us.
But for now, thanks for listening and happy reading.